Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. We started looking at deceptive sexuality trauma in the last episode, and in particular, we broke it down into two different ways of thinking about trauma. Those are acute traumatic impacts and complex trauma that can occur from patterns of harm over time. In the next couple of episodes, I'm going to focus more on the acute trauma and the impacts that often occur when a secret sexual basement is discovered within an intimate relationship. To do so, we're going to look through the lens of PTSD and spend some time going through the clinical diagnostic criteria of PTSD as a way of understanding acute trauma on a deeper level. And we can then tie that back into how those things might apply specifically to deceptive sexuality trauma. As a brief reminder, in the previous episode, I talked about this metaphor of a car crash to describe the acute impact here. The idea of a collision between two realities. You have the intentionally manipulated reality that the partner has been living in due to the patterns of deception and manipulation. So that's the reality as the partner believed it to be. And then you have the reality as it actually is or actually was, which includes the secret sexual basement, which only the person who had built and maintained the basement knew about. When discovery or disclosure occurred, those two realities collided together and caused significant acute damage, just like a car crash. And the force of that impact causes acute psychological trauma. Another way of thinking about this, another metaphor that I mentioned, is of the home above collapsing and falling into the basement below. And again, it's that idea of those two realities colliding. The home above that the partner thought was her reality, collapsing into the actual reality of the secret sexual basement underneath. And again, when we picture that, it's important to grasp that sense of destruction that's occurring as a way of understanding the psychological impact of discovery. And it's important that we move beyond seeing it as just the discovery of something that's hurtful or painful for the partner. We really need to grasp that sense of the partner's reality being shattered. What they thought to be true about their partner, their relationship, and even themselves is no longer true. So there is that real sense of shattering, a destabilizing impact that occurs, that takes away a lot of the cognitive structures, the beliefs and the safety nets that the person was potentially relying on within their life. And if we now go back to this idea of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, something that many people will have heard of but not necessarily know what it's actually about. We briefly mentioned it last time. And we can start by looking at the diagnostic criteria itself. So here's a brief, abbreviated look at some of the significant criteria for post-traumatic stress according to the DSM. So number one, it involves exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So exposure to some kind of traumatic event. Number two, it results in intrusions and intense psychological distress due to reminders of that event. Number three, it results in avoidance or numbing of thoughts, feelings, or those external reminders. Number four, it leads to negative alterations in the person's thoughts and mood. And number five, it leads to alterations in the arousal of the nervous system or increased reactivity of the person. Now, for partners presenting with deceptive sexuality trauma, they will often fulfill in various ways all of those criteria above, apart from the first one of actual threat of death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So that's the one outlier in a sense that makes this not quite fit in with the formal diagnosis of PTSD. Because of the hidden nature of the betrayal that's occurring, there generally isn't that sense of actual threat present because it's not known about. But again, we'll very often see the rest of the criteria in various ways. So now let's go through each one of those, but really link it specifically to deceptive sexuality trauma. So if we start with the second one, intrusions and intense psychological distress due to reminders, the word we're going to most likely be familiar with for this point is triggers. The idea of the partner being triggered, reminded in some way of what has occurred. And the word trigger or being triggered is something that's really caught on in society in many ways nowadays, and is used, I would say, quite flippantly a lot of the time. So it's important to be accurate here in what we're actually meaning. And I'm going to talk about two different things here, intrusions and triggers, and then the psychological distress that they lead to. When we think of intrusions, we're talking about involuntary intrusive thoughts that enter into the person's mind, as well as dreams that might occur. So these are occurring internally, whereas when we're thinking of triggers, we're thinking of an external stimuli of some kind. I see something, I hear something, I smell something that reminds me of what happened. And that definition is important, but what's really important for us to understand is the concept of persistent re-experiencing. So the common mistake we make is to stop at the idea of it being a reminder. So there's a trigger that reminds me of what occurred, reminds me of the traumatic event. What actually occurs is that there's a reminder, again, either through the form of an intrusion or a trigger, and then the person goes through a subjective re-experiencing of the event. So much more than just thinking about what happened or being reminded about what happened. They are actually re-experiencing the feelings, the sensations, the physiological impact of what happened. And when a person is re-experiencing a traumatic event, the nervous system is very likely to be in hyperarousal, in survival mode. And when a person is in survival mode, they are likely to be so much more reactive. And it's really critical to remember at this point that this is normal and to be expected for the victim of a traumatic event. It is expected for them to be highly sensitive to any potential threat. And in this case, when we're talking about the discovery of a secret sexual basement, there's a huge scope for potential triggers linked to the acting out that occurred in the basement. It could be that seeing a certain type of person, perhaps a specific body type or hair color, causes triggers. It could be that going to the beach and seeing people in swimwear is triggering. It could be that any kind of romantic or sexual scene on a TV program or in a movie is now very triggering. Specific people could trigger me, certain places could trigger me, it could be hotels, it could be certain parts of town, it could be specific names. There can be so many different things, and again, I think we've done a disservice to this word trigger in the way that we often use it in our society now, where it's unfortunately often become shorthand for I didn't like what someone said or I don't agree with somebody's views. When we correctly understand what a trigger is in terms of acute trauma and the intense psychological distress it can result in, it's something we need to take very, very seriously. And we also need to remember that this is primarily happening on a subconscious level. This is about the nervous system going into survival mode, going into fight or flight. So this is an intensely unsafe position for a partner to be in when they are subjected to frequent triggers and all of the distress that comes with them. That leads us to the next criteria, that it results in avoidance or numbing of thoughts, feelings, or external reminders. It makes sense, given everything I've just said about triggers and how devastating they are, that somebody is likely to do whatever they can to avoid those triggers. And one of the outcomes of that is that the person's internal and external worlds often become very constricted. Internal constriction might mean the avoidance of certain thought processes, or perhaps even forms of denial in order to cope. It might mean the suppression of emotions. The person might be tempted to numb out by using technology more, watching more TV, spending more time scrolling on their phone. They might be drinking more alcohol. And then when we think about external constriction, that might take the form of withdrawing from socializing with other people or being around other people. As I said before, because of the risk of triggers, there might be places where they no longer feel safe. So a partner's often stuck in this real catch-22 of if they try and function normally in life, they are exposed to so many potential triggers with their devastating consequences But when they constrict their life in response to that threat, it can take away a lot of the things that actually brought the partner joy or social connection, and which would otherwise be helpful sources of healing. Again, we really need to understand these things through this lens of trauma in the betrayed partner and not pathologize these reactions. It makes sense that the partner would want to numb and avoid the psychological pain associated with deceptive sexuality. The next criteria, after intrusions and triggers and then avoidance and numbing, was negative alterations in thoughts and mood. It really goes without saying that after the discovery of a secret sexual reality in the relationship, there are going to be really significant impacts on the thoughts and the feelings of the partner. Starting with thoughts, we're very likely to see persistent negative beliefs, perhaps about the self, about the partner that built the basement, about other people. There might be persistent blaming of the self, with the partner feeling like they should have done something differently, they should have known, or questioning whether there was something wrong with them. Was I not enough? There's likely to be a high level of preoccupation with the basement and what happened there, particularly as the partner is trying to piece together her new reality. And when we think about alterations in mood or emotions, there's very likely to be significant grief and a sense of loss or mourning of the reality that the partner thought she had versus the reality she now knows, which includes the secret sexual basement. There's likely to be high levels of fear and hypervigilance for some of the reasons we've already mentioned. There's also very likely to be significant anger, rage, high levels of dysregulation. There may be depressive symptoms, deep sadness, deep grief about what's occurred, symptoms of anxiety, panic attacks, especially as the partner often feels so unsafe as they're trying to piece together that reality. There might be a general constriction of emotions. Again, this is linked to that idea of numbing that I discussed. But there might be a high level of suppression, maybe an inability to experience positive emotions anymore, maybe an inability to enjoy the things that the partner once enjoyed. And then the final criteria was alterations in nervous system arousal and reactivity. I'm sure you can see how these things are all linked together because we started by talking about intrusions and triggers and how they lead to re-experiencing, which then leads to hyperarousal of the nervous system. And remember, when the system is in hyperarousal, then safety-seeking and self-protection become the primary focus. And if I found out that I've been lied to for years because I've discovered that there was this secret reality that was being hidden from me, I'm now likely to be hypervigilant to any perceived threat, and particularly in this case, any sense that my partner isn't being fully honest with me is going to be an extremely destabilizing event. It could be as simple as the tone of the partner's voice or the person's body language, but any perceived incongruence becomes a threat that causes an alarm to go off in my nervous system. And if someone is in this persistent state of nervous system arousal, it follows that there's also going to be a general high level of reactivity from that person. Some of the things that we would expect to see would be irritability, aggression, even violent behavior, or self-destructive or reckless behavior. A high degree of hypervigilance, as I mentioned, maybe an exaggerated startle response, the person being very on edge. Perhaps problems with concentration and focus, which might have significant practical impacts on the person's life, the person's work, their ability to function in the ways they did previously. There's likely to be significant disturbance to their sleeping patterns. So you can see there's this sort of vicious cycle going on where, because of the triggers and intrusions, the person is then going into re-experiencing, which means their nervous system is in a high state of arousal a large proportion of the time, which makes them very, very vigilant to any threat, which then leads to more triggers, more intrusions. And so there's this ongoing sense of the person being destabilized, their system in this constant state of fear, and ultimately the person feeling very unsafe a lot of the time. There's so much I've covered there, and I always want to name that for people listening to this, it might be very painful to hear some of this stuff if this is an experience you're going through right now. But I hope it's very validating to that experience as well. So I'm going to draw this episode to a close, but in the next one, I want to really start looking at how this understanding of acute trauma impacts the potential journey forward. And there's two things to really consider there. Number one is how these reactions from the partner can be pathologized and the victim blaming that can occur because of that. I really want to state again as clearly as I can that everything I've spoken about today is normal for somebody who has gone through an acute traumatic experience. And then secondly, we can look at how and why safety becomes the most important condition that we need to work towards for any healing to be able to happen for the partner. If someone's system is in hyperarousal, you really can't do the healing work until that person can be grounded, and a person can't be grounded if they don't feel safe. These are incredibly important things for us to look at, and again, we'll start breaking that down more in the next episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.